But tonight we have Psalm 99 to get into. So let's get into Psalm 99. And I just realized I brought my notes out here and left my Bible in my office. So I'm going to use this Bible. Psalm 99 is short and powerful. Short and powerful. And it combines two themes, the sovereignty of God and the holiness of God. And getting into it tonight, I want you to think about degrees of separation in your life. Okay, so for example, you know that I enjoy playing golf. If you don't, I enjoy playing golf. I am better than the average golfer. Now, the average golfer is really bad. Okay, so a good score in golf, if you're not a professional, a good score is if you play scratch, and that's basically you're right at, even par, or just a little bit above it. Most golfers aren't that. Okay, I think the average American golfer score is 118. All right, highest score does not win. Okay. I shoot in the mid-80s on a good day. Professionals shoot in much lower than that. A good day for a professional on a much harder course, because they play at much harder courses, they're going to be in the mid-60s, and that's how they really have to compete. But even when you think about that, the degree of separation from the average golfer to the professional golfer is, there's no comparing that. If you want to move outside the realm of sports, the degree of separation between my wife's awesomeness and my awesomeness is substantial. My wife is way more awesome, right? And every husband would agree with that, or they should. The degree of separation between my knowledge of the world and my 3-year-old son's is substantial. Not because I'm a genius, but because my son is 3. There's a substantial degree of separation. The degree of separation between our natural morality and God's holiness is incomparable. Far more than even the degree of separation of someone who watches golf on Sunday and someone who plays golf on Sunday for a living. And certainly, incomprehensibly more than capacities of human knowledge, like my son in comparison to me. And so tonight, the psalm is going to note specifically the incomparable difference between God's person and us, and what it requires for us to be able to have presence with Him and Him to have presence with us. And then when we understand that degree of separation more and more, because the more we know of God, and the more humbly we look at ourselves, because the more we grow in our maturity, as our view of God gets bigger, our view of self gets smaller, the more we appreciate and cherish and love the gospel. And so this psalm, by noting together the sovereignty of God and the holiness of God, gives us a greater understanding of the degree of separation between us and God, and therefore a greater love and thanksgiving. So having said that, and giving us some categories to think, in which to think, let's read Psalm 99. The Lord reigns. Let the peoples tremble. He sits enthroned upon the cherubim. Let the earth quake. The Lord is great in Zion. He is exalted over all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. The King, in his might, loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God. Worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Moses and Aaron were among his priests. Samuel also was among those who called upon his name. They called to the Lord, and he answered them. In the pillar of the cloud he spoke to them. They kept his testimonies and the statute that he gave to them. O Lord our God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, but an avenger of their wrongdoings. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy mountain, for the Lord our God is holy. Let's pray, and we'll begin to work through the passage together. Father, we thank you for this truth. We thank you for the text that's before us, for its power, for its majesty, for its practicality. And so I pray this evening that you would do what we've asked for already. You'd give us a high view of who you are and subsequently a low view of ourselves. That we would respond with humble praise, with sincere thanksgiving, considering what you have done through your Son to bring us to yourself. And I ask these things through your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, I told you the psalm works with two primary ideas working as one. So it's really these two theological concepts that are driving the main singular theme, which is the sovereign holiness of God, or the holy sovereignty of God. And so let's look together in verses 1 through 5 at his sovereign separateness. His sovereign separateness. And I use that word on purpose, not just because it's alliterated, but to further round out our view as we think about God's holiness, and because I want to continue to tap into this terminology of the separation between us and God, this incalculable difference between who God is and who we are. And because holiness, in one of its most basic definitions, is literally separateness, his set-apartness, that he is in a category all of his own. But you note, as with the majority of the Psalms, beginning in 92 and up to 100, a psalm dedicated to his sovereignty, we begin with this refrain that we've seen constantly throughout the Psalm 90s. The Lord reigns, and so we're oriented immediately to acknowledge his sovereignty. The Lord reigns. And what do the people do when they consider his reign? Let the peoples tremble. He sits enthroned upon the cherubim. Let the earth quake. The psalmist, we don't know who it is exactly here. We have an idea of where he's placed in history, and obviously it is after the poetic books, or after the historical books, because he references Samuel. But we don't know exactly who he is, but he wants us to immediately understand the sovereignty of God as powerful, as intimidating, as fearful. The people tremble. He sits enthroned upon the cherubim, higher than any of the spirit beings. Let the earth quake. Literally, actually, the idea, he sits upon the cherubim, obviously these being spirit beings. The visual we're supposed to have in our mind is that God, it's like he's sitting on a massive moving throne. It's like he's being carried by the power of the cherubim. It's literally like the throne of God is hovering in the heavens over the earth. Let the earth quake. Again, powerful terminology. The Lord is great in Zion. Remember when we think of Zion in the Psalms, we think of God's presence, we think of his peace, and we think of and we anticipate the future, because there will be a regathering in Zion, and initiating finally the prosperity of Israel, the peace of Israel. He's exalted over all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. And then we have this first repeated refrain, holy is he. Repetition is obviously key to the psalm. The king in his might loves justice. You've established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God. Worship at his footstool. Holy is he. So the concept of God's justice is sandwiched in between these ideas of these phrases of God's holiness. So these two phrases, they're inclusio passages that cause us to look inside them. Holy is he. And then within that idea of his holiness, we have the execution of his justice. And you note that it's perfect justice with the idea of repetition. The king in his might loves justice. You have established equity. This is another way to say human balance. You have executed justice, and you do what's right or righteousness in Jacob or in Israel. And therefore we respond with exaltation. Exalt the Lord our God. Worship at his footstool. In other words, recognize your place before him. On your face. Before his throne. Holy is he. So his sovereignty and his separateness. The people at this time would have had a much greater understanding of God's holiness than you and I do. In fact, I think one of the most important theological aspects in the Scriptures in relation to the person of God is his holiness. And I think one of the most forgotten theological concepts in today's church, especially in America, is God's holiness. We're well-versed on maybe salvation theology, and we should be thankful for a renewed love and passion and teaching on soteriology, and we're thankful for that over the last few decades. And maybe perhaps we're well versed, hopefully, on, I say we, I mean our circle, because larger, I don't think we can really say that we are. Hopefully, we really are. We have our nuts and bolts of our church theology down right, and we have a high church theology or ecclesiology. But when it comes to the holiness of God, we just don't have this understanding that he is so massively, inexplicably, categorically different than us. And I think some of it's human nature. We want to accommodate things a certain way so that we can sink our teeth into it and we can understand it. And to a certain extent, that's good. I mean, to a certain extent, that in reality, that's why we have Jesus Christ. There are certain human aspects about Jesus that we resonate with and we're thankful for and we appreciate and we understand and we cherish and we love. But Jesus is holy. And Jesus will execute final judgment and holy wrath. He will judge the living and the dead. And so even in our concepts of the person of Christ, maybe perhaps we've denigrated them so much in our attempt to understand them that we've actually made them like us. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we really want a faith where the God is like us? Because if you can quantify God, you have no reason to trust him. If you can wrap your mind around him, it completely expels the need for faith. Now, one of the reasons they had such a powerful view of God's holiness is because they had history to look into, and the psalmist is going to get to that. This is an interesting psalm to try to categorize what kind of psalm it is. Is it a hymn? Is it a historical psalm? It's. I think there's several things going on here. I think at the end of the day, it's probably a hymn, but you and I don't have the same visuals literally in our history for the holiness of God, but what has happened in our misunderstandings of who God is categorically and how he's not like us is we have become like an unholy world. And we accept unholiness into our life, whether blindly or intentionally. And the church has accommodated the culture so that we allow unholiness into the church because categorically we want to make God like us. And so we've actually become more sinful simply because we don't understand the separation between God and us. When if we had a view of the majestic, inexplicable power of God, separateness of God, categorical distinction, it would fuel our fear of Him in a good way, our honor for Him, our reverence for Him. I think we'd watch different shows. I think we'd listen to different music. I think we'd say different words. Because God is in a category all of His own. His sovereign separateness. Exalt the Lord. This theme of praise centering around His holiness as our sovereign King. And then the psalmist does something that's fascinating, and structurally this is a little bit of a challenging psalm as well to really put together. I think most translations, if they break it down, are probably going to have verses 1 through 5, and then verses 6 and 7, and 8 and 9. And that's probably the way that it works in the poetry, but in the flow of the logic, it's better to keep 1 through 5 together and 6 through 9 together. So we first of all look together at His sovereign separateness. Now let's look together at His shared separateness, or His accommodation towards us, His holy accommodation, how He has made Himself available and accessible to us. Now we know who Moses was, and I think one of the important, because Moses, out of these three in verse 6, Moses and Aaron were among his priests. Also among them was Samuel. We know naturally that Aaron and Samuel are priests. We think a lot of things about Moses. He was the leader of Israel. He was maybe one of the first true deliverers of Israel. These kinds of things. But it's important to remember that he had a priestly responsibility. He represented the people before God, namely on the mountain. And so even before a priesthood of Aaron was established, Moses was essentially the first and most direct priest as he represented the people before God on the mountain, on Sinai, and then the receiving of the law, and then everything that took place there. And so that's why the psalmist here acknowledges him as a priest, because biblically we know that he had this responsibility of representation. They called to the Lord, and He answered them. In the pillar of cloud, He spoke to them. Remember, I said just a minute ago they had a much clearer understanding about His holiness, and one of the reasons they did is because they had things in their history that you and I just don't have. And they're naturally going to think of God in a different category if He speaks to them thundering from a powerful cloud, which is what takes place here. They called to the Lord, and He answered them. In the pillar of the cloud He spoke to them. They kept His testimonies and the statute that He gave to them. And so He shares Himself. And even though He is categorically different, He makes Himself accessible. And how does He do this in verse 6? It's really, there's no move or transition into the poetry here in verse 6. It's just immediately there's a focus on the priesthood. We've talked about His holiness and His sovereignty, verses 1 through 5. And there's an immediate transition in the poem to the priesthood, verse 6. Because obviously we understand that God shared Himself at this time in history and then into the New Testament era until the finished work of Christ. He shared Himself and He made Himself accessible through the ministry of the priests. And they had a very important responsibility in going into the Holy of Holies and doing their priestly rituals and rites to represent the redemptive need and the atoning need of the people, that through those sacrifices there would be atonement. But here, note, it is not primarily sacrificial ritual or even tabernacle ritual that is the content of verses 6 and 7. It's that God communicates with them. Do you see that? In the pillar of the cloud, He spoke. So the psalmist has just gone from painting this picture of God as terrorizing, fearful, quaking, people falling before Him, to now Him speaking to people. Exodus 19:9, the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that people may hear, and when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever." When Moses told the words to the people of the Lord, the words of the Lord to the people, the word from the Lord comes out of the cloud, and Moses relays it to the people. Exodus 33:9, when Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. I mean, what an incredible thing Moses experiences here. So he speaks, he makes his presence known. So this holy God in verses 1 through 5 that seems so unapproachable is actually approaching man, is speaking to them, has a message for them. And in this covenant, he does it through men, Moses and Aaron, the first of the priestly tribes, the first of the priestly orders. But it's a broken tribe, it's a broken order, it's a broken priesthood, because they failed, and Moses failed. You say, well, what about Samuel here? If you look at verse 8, there's a clear problem with these priests, and it's obvious actually that the writer has Aaron and Moses in mind more than Samuel. So it's not that Samuel never failed in his life, it's that Moses and Aaron failed in a very specific way. And how did they fail? Very specifically in the way that Samuel didn't. In their priesthood, in their representation of God to the people. So he's holy and he makes his presence known, but in his grace he extends pardon. Exodus 20, verse 12, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, in your what? Representation, in your priestly responsibility. Therefore you should not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. Moses' sin was disobedience. You know Aaron's sin, the creation of an idol. Deuteronomy 9, Moses, speaking of the Lord's disfavor with Aaron, says this, and the Lord was so angry with Aaron that he was ready to destroy him. And I prayed, that is probably a prayer of intercession for Aaron at the same time, pleading for Aaron's life. Moses, speaking of the Lord's unfavor with him, Deuteronomy 3, but the Lord was angry with me because of you and would not listen to me. And the Lord said to me, enough from you, do not speak to me of this matter again. He failed in his priestly representation. And so he required pardon. In case you didn't know this, if you study the line of Aaron, I don't have time to trace it for you this evening, but if you study the line of Aaron, then you study the history of Israel, do you know it's the scribes and Pharisees that develop from Aaron's line in the intertestamental period, and it's Aaron's line that puts Jesus to death? You want to talk about failing in priestly responsibility. They started with idolatry. They ended by murdering Messiah. But God has a plan. And where do we end up after noting this forgiveness, noting His presence, noting His holiness, that He seems so inaccessible in verses 1 through 5, it's just too much for us. There's no way we can come to this God. But He has priests, but those priests fail. Where do we go from here? Verse 9, exalt the Lord our God and worship at His holy mountain. You're supposed to think of Moses. You're supposed to think Moses. Worship at the mountain. Acknowledge the holiness of God. Hear from the word of God. Why? For the Lord our God is holy. So He shares His separateness and His presence by expressing mercy, which results in our praise. There's a very obvious theological concept, and I'm sure you've picked out that I've been working towards it over the last few moments. How can we come before the God of verses 1 through 5? I mean, the earth trembles before Him. He sits on a throne of spirit beings that transport Him, as it were, around the earth. Reigns over the heavens. He speaks in clouds and storms and thunders through the earth. How can we come before a God like this? Well, He sent priests. Well, those priests fail. Even the best of them. Hebrews chapter 10 talks about an event that brings hope, that initiates a new time, that accommodates and accounts, or that accounts for the failures of priests. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places, that is the Holy of Holies, the tabernacle, the presence of God, we have confidence to enter the presence of God. That is the God of verses 1 through 5 in Psalm 99. By a new and living way that He opened for us through the curtain that is through His flesh. One of the most significant moments in the entire Bible is forgotten on us, because of the way the gospel writers mention it, sometimes almost in passing, but it's one of the most significant transitions in the entire Bible. It's when Jesus breathes His last, and the 3-inch thick curtain in the temple is torn in two. Because that curtain, before Jesus completed sufficient sacrifice, was a warning to the people that if you went through, you would die. But because of the sufficient work of Jesus Christ, now you can and must go in, or you will die. Why? Because we have a priest. Verse 22, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean. Why? Because He's cleaned us on the inside, and He did not need to cleanse Himself because He was already clean. So we can enter confidently into the holiness of God. Because Christ, the sufficient priest, has closed the gap. Jesus alone closes the degree of separation between our sin and God's holiness. Moses can't do it. He got angry and disobeyed. Aaron can't do it. He literally had descendants who raised Jesus up on the cross. Samuel can't do it. He's flesh, born of the same fallen curse like you and me. But our great high priest has opened for us a new and living way through the curtain that is his flesh. And the incalculable degree of separation between the holiness of God and the fallenness of man is bridged by the sufficiency of Jesus Christ. So now you come before the God of verses 1 through 5, honoring him with a reverential and adoring fear. Not a fear of danger. And you come confidently. So who closes the gap? Christ alone. And it is these truths, recognizing the goodness of God and the person of God and the category of God, and recognizing ourselves and the infinite difference that causes us daily to treasure the gospel, have an unceasing affection for Jesus Christ. You see, this is so like in the clouds, and it's okay. The next time you sin, the same sin that you've sinned your entire life, and you're so done with it, and you're so frustrated, and you think, I should be through this by now, I don't know what my problem is, and you go through the whole thing, like we all do. You recognize that God, who is so far removed from that sin, He doesn't have any capacity to commit that sin that you just did, has provided His beloved Son, and through that Son says, just come on. You're still welcome here. Let's be family. And what it does in that moment is it humbles you to confession and praise and thanksgiving. And we exalt the holiness of God. And it gives us a passion to continue to live holy. If we know that Jesus Christ died so that the command to be holy as God is holy is now actually possible, we would live differently. And until the day that we are separate from sin, no longer have a category for a fallen body, let's live a holy life, acknowledging the sovereignty of God, treasuring the redemptive work of Christ, looking to our great high priest, who's making us like God every day. And every single day we live our life, we conform to that image. The gap between God's holiness and our sin is closed progressively, just a little bit more.